Good morning. Welcome to the program. 13 minutes after 6 o'clock, 6:13 on 1460 KION. Mark Carbonaro with you on Wake Up Monterey, your KION community forum. To kick off the program this morning, we have a very special guest to join us, and that is Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo. Now, Dr. DiLorenzo is a professor of economics at Loyola College in Maryland. He's also a senior fellow at the Mises Institute, which is in Auburn, Alabama. And he is not only an economist, but I'd also say that he's a historian as well. And he brings a unique perspective to American history because he is able to not only tell the history of what happened, but oftentimes the economic motivation behind a lot of things that happened in our history. And that's a very important consideration. You know, you remember the old Watergate saying, follow the money. Well, it's the same thing when you're looking at history. You have to follow the money to know what happened and what was going on. Tom, welcome to the program.
I'm pleased to be with you this morning.
Hey, thank you very much for joining us. I got to tell you, I really enjoyed your exchange recently on the Morning Joe program with Pat Buchanan. That was a lot of fun watching the two of you talk about U.S. history. And what I thought was really interesting was, as you and Pat were talking about various economic downturns and what caused them, and obviously the two of you know your subject matter pretty well, I was watching the faces of the co-hosts, and they had no idea where you guys were going or what you were talking about.
Yeah, that's very true. They are media people, talking heads after all. They're not economists or historians like me or Pat Buchanan.
Yeah, but you know, I think what part of the reason that we're in such a terrible fix today is the fact that by and large the general population knows or cares little to know about our history and our economic history and how we got to the point where we are today. And oftentimes when people hear these things, they're like revelations to them. For example, the latest book that you have written is about Alexander Hamilton, and it's called Hamilton's Curse, and we want to talk about that book this morning because I think it's an important book. It's Hamilton's Curse, How Jefferson's Arch Enemy Betrayed the American Revolution and What It Means to Americans Today. All right, what exactly is Hamilton's Curse, Tom?
Well, I call Alexander Hamilton the founding father of crony capitalism. He was a political genius, among other things, but his political agenda, was to tie the interests of the more affluent or more wealthy people of the country to the government by making them bondholders, by issuing a lot of government debt. And he thought that these bondholders then would provide political support forever for bigger government, higher taxes, and just a more expansive government than what the Constitution itself called for. And that was Hamilton's agenda. He was there was one political scientist who called him the Rousseau of the right, and Rousseau was sort of the ideological godfather of the French Revolution, which is very different than the American Revolution. And so, of course, he advocated what we today call corporate welfare in the form of subsidies for corporations. He was a protectionist on trade policy, and I guess that's why Pat Buchanan likes him so much. And he's also considered to be the founding father of the central bank. He was the moving force behind our first central bank, which was called the Bank of the United States. And oddly enough, I've written this book about Alexander Hamilton's economics, and it really does explain the dilemma we're in today because, what is the bailout, the Wall Street bailout, but crony capitalism?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was struck by something that you said about him, being that he was the first Secretary of the Treasury. He was an appointed bureaucrat, and he was the first one to start the long line of unaccountable appointed bureaucrats that have great power, control over the lives of average Americans.
Right. Yeah, the first thing he did was he tried to greatly expand the Treasury Department so that it would be the dominant force in the whole government. And, of course, in those days, the whole entire government was very tiny. But he constantly complained to George Washington that we needed a government of more energy, he said. He denounced the Constitution because the Constitution placed too many limits on the government, and he called it a frail and worthless fabric. And his view of the Constitution was that it could be reinterpreted by clever lawyers like himself to become a stamp of approval on anything the government ever did, as opposed to a series of constraints, which is what his nemesis, Thomas Jefferson, thought the Constitution ought to be. Mm-hmm. Jefferson once said the government needed to be bound by the chains of the Constitution. But nowadays we have Hamilton's Constitution. It really does nothing to restrain the government. And whenever politicians do bring up the Constitution, it's just to make the point that, well, what we are doing is constitutional because we say it is.
Right, exactly. That sounds like that Supreme Court justice from the 1930s in justifying many of the programs in the New Deal.
I quote a historian, a historian of the Constitution, who was a New Deal liberal, and he was very happy writing in the 1950s of the fact that Hamilton's view of the Constitution had prevailed by then, mm-hmm. that the words of the Constitution had been twisted so much that it was essentially meaningless as a restriction on governmental power. And this was Clinton Rossiter was the man's name. He taught history at Cornell for many years. But they were celebrating the Hamiltonian view of the Constitution way back in the 50s, and it's only gotten worse since then.
Absolutely.
In my view.
You know, Tom, one of the things that you write in the book and you cover in there is how one of the things that Hamilton did was to wrest control into the hands of the federal government by inventing the myth of the Constitution's implied powers. Where did Hamilton find the implied powers that he could exploit in a way that gave him that much power?
Well, this came about in his debate with Thomas Jefferson over the constitutionality of a central bank. Jefferson said, no, the Constitution would have to be amended to have such a thing because, of course, a bank like that was not among the delegated powers in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And that's when Hamilton invented the idea of implied powers. He said, well, you have to read between the lines to find these things. And Jefferson pretty much responded by saying, well, I have read between the lines and there's blank space there. But Hamilton prevailed. We got this bank. And then jurists from then on, especially his friend John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice for 34 years, beginning in 1801, used this idea of implied powers of the Constitution to really eviscerate the constitutional constraints on government that were the original intent.
You know, I understand that your book was just published yesterday officially, the 21st of October.
Right.
So and it should be out in the stores now if we want to get a copy of it.
Right, wherever books are sold, including Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was one of the things that Hamilton did was he tried to establish an imperial presidency, and he proposed the presidency be permanent. But do you think that the concept of the UET, the Unified Executive, theory of the president, comes from Hamilton?
Yeah, I think it sure does. There's always been a Hamilton versus Jefferson strain in the Republican Party, and this is where this idea comes from. But at the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton proposed a permanent president who would appoint all the governors and have veto power over all state legislation. So he essentially would have been like a king. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's why we didn't get that system at the beginning. The Jeffersonians said, "Well, we just fought a revolution against this." But you're right. That's essentially what we've got now, where our president now can not only is he sort of dictatorial and he rules by executive orders, but he can send our military overseas to just about any country in the world without congressional approval, and that's even far more than what even Alexander Hamilton would have envisioned in terms of a powerful or dictatorial executive.
One of the things that's interesting, too, is over the weekend we went and saw the movie W, and one of the previews while we were waiting for the main feature to come on, they were showing some previews of a new movie, the Frost-Nixon movie, about that conversation that David Frost had with Richard Nixon. And it was at that time, as you might recall, that Richard Nixon made that rather stunning statement, one of incredible conceit, where he said, well, you have to understand, David, that when the president does it, it's legal. In other words, Richard Nixon was justifying every wrong thing he'd ever done in office, or any president might do, by saying that if the president does it, it's legal. And of course, that's really an extra constitutional view of the office.
It sure is. I'm sure Joseph Stalin said the exact same thing in his day. And the frightening thing is so many Americans sort of buy into this idea of the strong president, and when they cheer on one or the other of the candidates who are running for president right now, some of the rhetoric they use is kind of crazy sounding. And And so I think a lot of Americans buy into this, but of course this was never the intent. George Washington was just the administrator of a very minor bureaucracy. The president was never meant to be the emperor of the world, like the American presidents think of themselves today. But that is, if you were to call it anything, I would call it Hamiltonianism, because he got this idea started of having a king, essentially, who would pursue empire. And Jefferson, of course, his view of the government was, well, it's only to protect life, liberty, and property, not to become an empire like the British Empire or the Spanish Empire. But that all changed throughout our history, and we certainly are an empire now. And as history teaches us, empires all eventually bankrupt themselves.
Mm-hmm. Which is essentially what we are doing at this point. We are absolutely bankrupting this country, and it seems that the people in Washington, if they know, they don't care, because we just seem to be going down this road. And you know, I think one of the things too that I'd like you to address here is that you know, there's only one way to feed an empire, and that's through a central bank and an internal revenue service. I mean, this is the thing, and I'm sure this is one of the reasons why Hamilton wanted these types of policies. The only way you can support an imperial presidency is through confiscatory taxation, and also through the issuance of debt and inflation through a central bank. So, if your vision is an executive who actually acts like a king, the only way you can support that is through the kinds of things that I mentioned. Is that necessarily the case?
Well, yes, because Hamilton understood that that's how the British Empire worked. They had the Bank of England printed money and financed the British Empire, and he essentially wanted to bring the British Empire here as a model of government. That's why the subtitle of my book is how Jefferson's archenemy betrayed the American Revolution. Americans just fought a revolution against that kind of government, that kind of empire. And the way Hamilton and his political compatriots saw it is a bad thing if you're on the paying end of an empire. But if you're on the tax collecting end, that's not a bad thing. It's good to be the king, as Mel Brooks might say.
Yeah.
Remember that old movie about the history of the world, Mel Brooks? I think it was the King of France who he portrayed as saying that. But that was basically Hamilton's idea. And, of course, that's why he wanted a bank that could print money and to finance what he called imperial glory. He thought the purpose of government should be the pursuit of imperial glory. And Jefferson and his followers understood that that would, one, bankrupt the country eventually, and two, it would eviscerate our liberties.
And I think that's what's happening now. You know, please expand for a moment on the concept of being on the receiving end of central banking, and how, you know, the first users of the dollars end up making the end users pay more.
Well, when the central bank prints money, the first users of the credit can benefit. And just look at the current housing boom. The original people who were in on investing in real estate, a lot of people made a lot of money. But then as prices rise, as the inflation comes, as a result of the printing of all this money, people who get in later on aren't going to make any money. And, of course, people who got in right at the apex of the housing market in '05, they're the ones who are all bankrupt now, and whether they're subprime or prime borrowers. And so, yeah, it does create great riches for some people, but it's a big gamble, and it usually creates a bust and a recession or a depression.
Mm-hmm. And so these are the kinds of policies, you know, that we've pursued today, that were actually the ones that were blueprinted by Alexander Hamilton as the first Treasury Secretary. Let me ask you this: how did Hamilton get this job? I mean, how did he get Washington to appoint him to be the Secretary of the Treasury? Because it sounds like George Washington wasn't a guy that believed in empire. He certainly didn't want to be President King. So how did he end up with Hamilton in there?
Well, Hamilton was a trusted aide. He was the hero of the Revolution, and you know, he should be praised for that. And so he was with Washington during the Revolution, and he had a background in business. And there weren't a lot of people who had that kind of a background around George Washington in business. And he was a New Yorker, and he had a lot of associates. And I think he had a lot of help by the New York bankers and the businessmen who made sure that their man was in the Treasury Secretary's job. And so he had a lot of friends in New York and Wall Street and elsewhere who helped him get that job. I don't think it was only his own doing.
Mm-hmm.
he married a very wealthy woman from a family, the Schuyler family in New York City, who were very well connected and wealthy. And I'm sure that had a lot to do with his political success, too.
So a guy being attached to New York bankers ends up being the Treasury Secretary. Things haven't changed very much in 200 and something years, have they?
No. I think it's a requirement for the job that you have to be the CEO of Goldman Sachs so that you can work for the benefit of Goldman Sachs as U.S. Treasury Secretary. That seems to be the rule.
Yeah. Do you think we're going to get out of this mess very easily, or are we stuck in the soup for a while here, Tom?
Well, the government is doing everything it can to slow down or stop the necessary adjustment or liquidation of assets and the repricing of assets that has to take place for the economy to return to normal. And so we're going to be in a recession much longer than we need to be as a result of that. And Congress just had to pass this bailout bill because it's an election year and they wanted to be seen as doing something. And, of course, they did absolutely the worst possible thing they could conceivably have done in going down the road of nationalizing a lot of the big banks in the country.
Which is probably something that someone like Hamilton would have agreed with. You know, the other day, a fellow that both you and I admire, Ron Paul, was on CNN's morning program talking with their the hostess of the program, and she kept hammering about about this bailout and how it's going to protect small people and it's ultimately good for the economy, and Congressman Paul was trying to get the point across that you just can't print money out of thin air and expect any good to come from it, and she wasn't getting it. And finally, the last thing he said, she got it. He said to her, "Listen, if this policy would work, why don't we just print up $4 trillion and pass it around to everybody and we'll all be fabulously rich?" And then the light finally went on in that dark place between her ears, and she got it.
Yeah.
But it just seems that what we are experiencing today is exactly what Mr. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, had proposed for this country, and we see the ruination of that policy. Do you think that we're going to be able to maybe convince people that Hamiltonian policies are ultimately destructive and we have to get away from them?
Centralized power, high taxes, a central bank that prints money, a huge public debt, these are all Hamilton's policies, and there was about a 75-year political battle over all of this in America from the time of the founding on until after the Civil War. But the Civil War was sort of a breaking point, and in fact, there are historians who I quote in my book who call the post-Civil War era the era of Hamiltonian hegemony, where all of these policies really took hold. Subsidies for the railroad corporations in the 1970s, central banking, the Fed, it was the big victory of Hamiltonianism. And now we're experiencing what I call in one of the latter chapters of my book, the poison fruits of Hamilton's Republic. And we're sort of on a cusp here, or a tipping point, where we can go either way. We can go the way of nationalizing industries like the Republican Party and the Democrats in Congress seem to want to go, or we can wake up and reverse course. And one of the reasons I write books like this is to give some information to people to decide maybe we shouldn't follow the same old course. Maybe we should reverse this and move in a totally different direction. All
right. Well, folks, this is a book you definitely want to get. I'll tell you what, this would be a great book to give to a student in going into high school or one in college. Make sure they get hold of this book and read it. You'd want to read this yourself. It's called Hamilton's Curse. And it's how Jefferson's arch enemy betrayed the American Revolution and what it means to Americans today by Dr. Thomas J. DiLorenzo. Tom, thank you so much for joining us here on KION.
My pleasure. Have a great day.